hello, everybody at home. You missed a little bit of stories. I don't know whether good thing or bad thing, but all right. So we are going to be both covering meta as usual, right? Dimensionality is about one of the overall meta concepts is that I talked about in the first and second, but especially, I don't even know if I should say probably both, definitely the first, is around progress, right? And I think it was in the second one where I showed you how actually you can track pretty much all your emotions, positive and negative, around progress, either being stuck, some form of formula regarding being stuck when it comes to negative emotions, and some kind of formula regarding the sense that you're going to make progress regarding positive emotions, or either you or someone you care about, which might be everyone, regarding progress. So we can also use that in terms of sales, and we're going to be discussing sales fairly a lot, I think, in dimensionality, and we're going to be tying it in with the overall meta and looking at both. And on the second dimensionality, I introduced a concept that as we develop it, it's going to be amazing. It's going to either particularly cause a breakthrough for you or clarify, tie together things I've talked about in the past. If you're more new with me, it can do it by itself perhaps. But the idea of realizing there's two processes that are constantly working, in essence, in tandem, or not, or one's missing, but knowing to look for two different processes rather than bunching and blurring them all into one process regarding a gray area process and a black and white process. And as I expand on that and explain to you what I know regarding that, and as I discover more and explain to you new stuff I discover, it's a distinction and critical piece of your model for understanding both individual issues and details in your life and also for understanding things overall. But I can hardly overstate the impact it'll have as we develop with it. I not from feedback, but just from watching like listening or being aware of my own talk on the second one, I think we have a lot to go. Like I introduced the distinction, but there's so much more to be said about it. So I doubt that it's had anywhere near the impact that it could have as we continue with me. And I don't know, I've talked here and there about my personal prowess with conversion and sales, but I want to emphasize to you at this point, I think it particularly matters, I'm really good overall at understanding the meta of what's going on with conversion and sales. A specific sales instance, such as selling in a particular live seminar or selling in a webinar or writing a particular sales letter or succeeding in a particular meeting, is strongly based on a lot of details that might need to be figured out, right? A lot like playing a computer game or playing any sport that you may or may not be familiar with. You can be good at sports or athletic or coordinated, but if there's a totally new sport, you might need to learn the rules and learn a lot about it. So there's going to be plenty of times when it might take me or anybody a process, and I might never happen to complete that process with a particular sales instance or situation. So sometimes I might have a specific recipe, but in most cases, what I do in business doesn't overlap exactly with what you guys do. So that's why I have to talk. Besides, it's something I'm interested in anyway, but I have to talk in a bit of a meta way. And it's also why I like when other people share their recipes. I loved having Mark Kirk on, right, last week. I loved having Jamie Washington on. There's some other people I'd like to have on, and it's why you want to pay particular attention to Stephen Floyd. I think he'll be covering some specific things that he does regarding sales for SEO. I think on Friday. I think in 2 days from when I'm doing this. Yeah, weren't they great? Thanks, Mike. I appreciate them so much, just unbelievable. I think we'll also have Jamie back. But overall, my understanding of sales and conversion in a kind of a meta way is very powerful, and you're going to want to learn it. And there isn't really a lot of substitute for learning from me about what I know about sales. There's plenty of people with valid and good recipes for what they do that can also give you lots of thoughts and hints for what you do. But you're going to want to combine that with what I have to share with you, and there isn't someone else that can necessarily duplicate that. Okay, now in terms of let's pop over to talking a bit about the book and applying it to some of the meta strategies and why I recommend it, and et cetera. By relating some thoughts about the book to the meta strategies that I've covered in the past and or pointing them out now, then it'll reinforce the book and the recipes themselves, and it'll reinforce the meta strategies, and together with that it'll complete a certain circuit for people. All right. Oh, let me ask you guys just to get a sense, just so I can calibrate a little bit. There's no right answer to this, but who's dipped into the book? And I realize not everyone might have their Facebook out or whatever, but if you want to let me know. Okay, coming. Bryce, Mike's about half done and loving it. I know that Adrian said something earlier. You said, the art of closing is great. Help me turn. He already has a testimonial from it. A no too expensive reply from a potential client to looking forward to hear what you can do for me. So that's a great thing. About 70%. Okay, don't everyone hop on at once. Okay, Maria, terrific. Half done, love it, great. Yeah, and when I give you guys a suggestion, Mike, what's my track record with suggesting books to you, fiction and nonfiction? How am I doing so far? And part of this is I don't suggest most of the books that I read, obviously. 100% track record. How badass is that? It's probably about a dozen or more, right, between fiction and nonfiction, including that means leading out hundreds of, actually a couple dozen, right? Okay. So when I give you a suggestion, it's not that often that I do this, but take it seriously. This book will be tremendous for you. So many, probably 50, yeah, awesome. Just got started, great. Okay, so am I guessing that there's several of you that also might not have looked at it yet? Okay, it's all good either way. I'll just calibrate in both directions. Just started, great. Not yet, okay, good. Okay, nifty, good to just get a sense. Ordered, awesome, great, good. I just picked mine up at Barnes & Noble. I hope Barnes & Noble doesn't close. I actually got my house was partly based on being near one, just because it's a fun place for me to go to and just look around. Okay, so the foundational frame is something I talk about, right, in my meta concepts. What's the foundational frame? Let me ask you this, just the book aside for a moment. What's the foundational frame for thinking about money getting, right? Now, one thing that isn't quite the outer frame but comes pretty quickly after it is how I break things up into product, traffic, and conversion, right? If you get those three questions right, then you'll be a multimillionaire if that's what you want. And most of us want at least be a multimillionaire. Some of us want even more than that, but those are three questions, which also means that if you're able to solve problem, if you turn those three into a problem or a question, if you're able to successfully answer questions and solve problems, then those are your three problems. You solve those together and you become a multimillionaire, period. Product, traffic, and conversion. But that's not what I have in mind for the foundational frame when it comes to money is going to involve, it's going to revolve around a certain word, right, which would be value, right? And I've harped on the idea of perceived value as an additional distinction for people because people get tied up in what they think of as actual value, right, where they say, even Bryce, I want to warn you, when you talk about solving people's problems, you want make sure whenever you're touching on value or problem solving, you're right, but if you don't make the distinction of perceived value, we are not thinking accurately enough, in my assertion, regarding money. See, if you're dealing with money, you're dealing with other people's priorities, other people's perceived value, unless you are either lucky or, like, you can, basically, if you're going to prioritize making money, and if you don't prioritize something, then you may not succeed because the path to it, right? If you can't make something that you want, a result that you want to get to, if you can't make it a priority within certain boundaries, then the path might not be there. The path might involve, it might be where your lack of making it a priority is constantly causing you to not find the path you need to get to the result. That might not be the case. There's plenty of things you'll end up being able to achieve in life without making it a priority, but you're taking a significant risk. And when it comes to money, it's tough. You don't necessarily want to risk that, right? I figured there's probably a way to get through life without money, but I found it easier to not figure that out, but instead just figure out how to make money. And it can be finite. It doesn't have to be an ongoing thing, right? You need just a certain amount. But you need to embrace the idea that if you're going to make money the priority, then you're going to need to let other people set priorities about what they value. If you instead are going to have a boundary, no, it has to be something that I judge is actually good for them. You can draw a boundary on something that isn't going to hurt somebody, sure. But when I say actually good, what I mean is best. Right? You're at some point going to need to adjust what you're selling to what people are going to want to buy. And if you want to get to what's really good for them, then you probably need to start with what they think is good for them, right? No matter what. And that's true generally, right? And in life and conversion, even separate from money, right? You generally have to start where someone's at, right? So that's just another way of explaining what I mean by perceived value. If you're going to be looking to make money, or if you're really going to be looking to persuade someone in general, if you're not willing to start with where they're at, if you're just stuck on, no, this is good for someone, or this is better for someone, then that can be a sticking point for you. That can get in your way. So make sure you're aware of that, and Bryce, keep that in mind when you talk about problem solving. Be looking to solve problems that people particularly want to pay for. Of course, if you're dealing with SEO, you probably are, but make sure you're identifying the right problem. And like I've talked about, very possibly in today's market, you're dealing more with people where business people when you're selling SEO services where what's their problem? It's not that they need traffic so much in their mind, right? Their problem isn't so much that they need leads or traffic, but it's that regarding SEO that they don't know who to trust and who's going to be competent, right? So you need to address that problem. You need to help them solve the problem of not knowing who to trust. And generally you can't solve that problem by just saying, trust me. You need to figure out a way to really solve it for them and really get through that, and then including succeeding with ranking their site, right, because so forth. So anyway, the foundational frame has to do with value. I don't know that the author, Anthony Iannarino, I don't think he necessarily points out that distinction of perceived value, but the good thing is he does talk about value as his kind of he might not use the word foundational frame, but he bases things on a value exchange. And he's constantly pointing out that you need to think in terms of exchanging value for a commit. And one of the great early ways he does that, he breaks things into 10 commitments. That his recipe does not necessarily apply to you, just the same as my recipe for selling OMG stuff doesn't necessarily apply to you exactly. In number 4, I'll get to some more thoughts about using someone else's recipe. But in his first commitment, where he talks about the first thing you need to do is get a commitment for someone's time. And then he points out that you need to trade value for that. And that can be a revelation for people, right? Because you might think, oh, I'm looking to solve their problem that they need traffic or even that they need someone they can trust. And they're thinking of that as the value that you're looking to trade. But that's the value that you're trading for, like what the author here has as the 9th out of 10 commitments. So you're skipping ahead to some degree, right? Whether or not you need all 8 prior commitments is very debatable, and probably you don't in what you're doing. He's selling in a lot of cases like in the 6-figure range of business-to-business type sales with staffing and solutions like that. So again, his situation is going to be different to some degree, but it'll be eye-opening going through his whole process. And so what he's thinking is that when he wants that initial meeting with somebody, he needs to trade value, and of course has to be perceived value, right? He he accomplishes that whether or not he uses the term. He needs to trade perceived value for that time, right? Which people can figure out to some degree, and it's certainly implicit within various techniques. Stephen Floyd certainly is great with this, with his site analysis that he'll give people on his networking right off the bat, right, and so forth. And then going over that analysis can be what you do in your my guess is that people can do what I use that I had that illustration driving out of San Francisco, right? What I mean by that when I say it is the idea of you can sometimes do something right, but then you can, if you don't realize where you are, you could you can meander into the right place that you're trying to get to, but if you don't know how to recognize it properly, then you can drive back out again randomly. So it might be something you do sometimes, and other times say, okay, yeah, great, we'll meet, but you don't really take seriously the value trade for just that time. And you're setting a good precedent and building, remember, you're trying to solve what problem for most of your potential clients, or is the issue of trust and competence, not of just getting traffic, right? That's the perceived value that they have and that they're looking for, whether they know it or not. And to be clear, I don't do a lot of SEO client getting specifically, so I'm actually guessing that and hearing that. If I'm wrong, that's okay. You can open your eyes and mind and look for what they're really looking for and what they perceive as valuable, but I'm probably right about that. But either way, I want to make sure that you at least see that angle so it opens you up to things to look for instead of just thinking that people want leads or traffic or the phone to ring. That it's not that they do or don't want that, but that's not really the bottleneck, right? So if you want to be breaking that bottleneck of them wanting someone that they can trust to be competent, then being serious about trading value right off the bat for their time is a big way that you can be dealing with that bottleneck, right? In addition to it being a good general practice, it's particularly helpful when you're probably dealing with the bottleneck of the trust and competence, right? So the more value you can pack into that initial meeting, rather than making it more of just a discussing your services meeting, so to speak, or even discussing what you can do for them, right, and so forth. Taking it seriously, and this author, Iannarino, he'll really set you up, I think, to look very good for the beginning regarding competence and trust, with his perspective on the parsing out that first commitment for time. And then the other commitments you can look up. I'm not going to, this isn't like a book review or a book report. So let's see here. Okay, so that deals with the first thing I wanted to point out was that he gets the foundational frame right, and then I gave that specific example of in the first commitment, he starts right off the bat in the first commitment with talking about you have to trade value. And even before he talks about the first commitment, he talks about the trading of value as he gives his overall philosophy, all right, which is very good in the book. All right, next, have you ever heard someone talk about a contextual approach to strategy where our default feeling of how to get results that our mind is going to give us and our default epistemology, which is an incorrect epistemology that is useful for you to have to get started, but it's incorrect, right? Your starting method of knowing what's true about the world and building a model of reality is not correct. It's useful, but not correct. That epistemology, which we pretty much all have, unless we totally overhaul our way of knowing what's true, which we do together, right? Obviously, you could do that with me, and you could do it on your own. But generally, people don't do it before they meet me. By default, your mind will constantly be definitely necessarily downplaying, diminishing your sense of so how important context really is will feel less, well, it won't feel as important as it is, right? I think you get what I'm saying. That's why Sun Tzu's Art of War, which is a very contextual approach to war, it talks about understanding yourself, understanding your opponent, picking the battlefield, and so forth, instead of how to swing your pike, right? He doesn't really talk about it as far as I remember, or how to shoot an arrow. He doesn't talk about how to fight with a sword or something. Again, as far as I remember. If I'm getting that wrong, I'm getting it wrong. I know he talks about choosing the battlefield and knowing yourself and others. I don't remember every detail he talks about. But it's contextual, and that's why it's a very successful and generally correct book. This book as well, it's brilliant in its contextual approach, because what you want to have a intentionally contextual approach to getting results that you're having any difficulty getting. The first thing you can do to try to get any result you want is just try to directly get it without being too creative. And you'll either get it or you'll get a sense of starting a full sense of what your bottlenecks are, right? So it's perfectly fine at first just walk up to the first business owner and just say, hey, do you want SEO services? And see if that works, right? But anyway, at some point you'll probably want a more effective approach than that really direct approach. So then you want to think about what you can get in your favor in the terms of context. And then people might think, okay, I want LinkedIn testimonials. I maybe want to start ranking a site, right, and so forth. In client getting, I made 2 videos where I give 10 tips and so forth, a certain recipe to increase your results with client getting. And they're all definitely correct, because even though I don't do SEO client getting, they're in between being too meta and too specific, where they definitely apply. I do plenty of sales and conversion type of interactions in my course of business, and I have for 20 years, that's very similar to SEO client getting. So I'm able to give mid-level types of advice. I think most of you have probably watched those. If you haven't, you definitely want to watch those, or if you don't remember them, rewatch them. One of the things I pointed out, and that's a contextual approach that's not in the book, it just illustrates types of contextual things, is the more clear you are on what you're going to do after they sign on the dotted line and become your client, what they're going to experience and what you yourself are going to do. And also, as you start to draw that plan out, you'll notice plenty of gaps that you thought you didn't have that you have, that are there in what your understanding is of what you're going to do after someone says yes. And you'll have the act of filling those in, plus the act of having a good plan of what you're going to do, even if you have 0 clients, is going to contextually help you sell for sure. Definitely. It's going to make you look more competent, more trustworthy. It's going to give you more confidence for real, right, for a good reason. And there might just be direct questions about it that you can answer quickly, which again improves the sense of trust and competence, right? You don't want to be hemming and hawing and being vague and blurry when their number one bottleneck is competence and trust, which of course is fostered by clarity, right, and quick, good answers that were well thought out ahead of time and so forth. So that's another piece of context that you can have in your favor, is having a good, clear plan for what you're going to do after someone signs on with you, rather than just telling yourself that you're sure you can do it. Sometimes mindset teaching has seeped into OMG, not from me, that implicitly tells you to ignore context and just bulldoze your way through it, be sure, tell yourself, delude yourself, and so forth. And I strongly disagree with anything that implies that preparation and context don't matter, ever. That's directly contrary to what I advise, and I think you are going to reliably have failure. Not every time, you'll get lucky sometimes. Or you'll join a program with me guiding you enough that you'll have great success. But then in other areas of your life, you'll have all kinds of issues if you ignore context. And what can lead to ignoring context is believing that just getting yourself in a peak state, believing in whatever, believing in yourself and all kinds of stuff might be a kind of in-the-moment mindset type thing. There's too much of an emphasis on that. Might be part of the context that can help you, but if you're relying on that in a way that prevents you or makes you feel like preparing and having other contextual things in your favor, then that's productive. Okay, so in terms of Iannarino's, this book, Lost Art of Closing, in terms of his contextual approach, brilliant in the sense of he breaks things down into 10 commitments, the 9th of which is where they sign on the dotted line, so to speak. The final one after that is like a commitment, I think, to follow through. If I have that might not be his exact words. What are his exact words here? The commitment to execute. Great. And the commitment to decide is the 9th out of 10, 9 out of 10. That's when they sign on the dotted line, pay you, and so forth. Execute is like follow through, right, on what you're doing. It's something I certainly pay attention to, right, when I sell OMG stuff, is thinking about people consuming and succeeding with the product is built into the sales process originally. Because why? Because I'm not just looking to make the sale. Of course, even the pricing reflects the fact I'm looking to build a long-term relationship and success with people. So contextually take that into account before the sale, because before the sale is different than after the sale, that a certain opportunity closes, just like with marriage or a relationship or any kind of agreement, right? Things you agree on ahead of time are different than things you try to tack on later. All right, Iannarino, in this book, his contextual approach is with these commitments. And so I know that it's come up during Alchemy and possibly after that in webinars. People have asked about closing. They have trouble asking for the money sometimes, and what can you do about that? And what you do about most anything where you're having trouble getting a result is what? You pay more attention to context than you first think, right? Because you're always going to think that context matters less, because our brain works by association, and that therefore it works by what I've called in the past neurological closeness, right? Whatever's closer in time, space, whatever's bigger, whatever's habitual association, whatever, but it's associated, it's close, right? Associations are stronger if they're close, they're thick, right? It's like you can picture neurons, right? If you have a big neural pathway just to one habit, or if something's like the thing that lights up, right, your first association on a Rorschach block test and so forth, it's close neurologically. That's not contextual, right? It's what's close. So what's close seems more important in your default way that your mind determines importance, which is a useful approximation to keep you functioning until you work on it yourself with your free will. But the overall bottleneck in life is that, I'm going back and forth here between specific examples in this book and meta, which is good. What's the overall bottleneck in life? I talked about the defense against the defense in Alchemy, but let me put it this way now. Your default epistemology, which has to do with association, which has to do with taking gray area in life and making it seem black or white, it tells you that it is the right epistemology. And your whole sense of importance is determined by nearness and what's already there in habit, neurological closeness, and it basically tells you that it's right about epistemology. So your default epistemology, which is wrong, one of the things that it's wrong about is that it itself is not wrong. And that's the circular trap that people are caught in. But we have all sorts of hints in life that that's not a trap we should be caught in. You can get out. And fundamentally, what matters to me is getting you out of that trap. Everything's easy after you get out of that trap. The rest is downhill, especially if you know me, right? Then you say, oh, okay, if my default epistemology isn't right, and you don't just say the words, it's really getting that. Because you can say the words and think you got it while I'm talking, and then wake up tomorrow and start all over again feeling like you're right about how you're right by default. Of course, if you get it right, then you will be right when you're using the right way of epistemology, which is, roughly speaking, when you can prove that the opposite has to be wrong, then you can know that the thing itself has to be right. And then we can understand consciousness fields and so forth, as I've talked about in the past. I'll talk about it again in the future, but just referring to what I mean. So I bring all that up because you're going to constantly feel that context, things that are neurologically farther, are less important, but that's simply false, right? Importance is determined by actual real-life impact, not by whether it's the first thing you come up with on a memory and an association test, right? or what's a habit. So our brain determines importance wrongly by default based on neurological closeness, association, and so forth. That's why it's so important to me personally not to send my child to school, because what happens, neurological closeness determines importance. So what's going to determine importance is his peers and teachers, right? And I don't want them determining what's important, because you can determine everything else about what you accomplish in life, and including your ethics and what kind of person you are, everything, your character, all can be led by the nose by importance, right? You can basically lead your own mind and therefore other people's minds like a rat with cheese or a horse with a carrot just by changing importance. And like if someone gets addicted to cocaine, right? Really all that changes in their life, or heroin or something, is their sense of importance. What's important? Nothing else really changes, right? Neurological closeness changes, not the concept of it. The concept is the same for everyone, right? And so generally people have something, right, that, or everyone, right, has stuff that's neurologically close that feels important. Whatever that is, that kind of determines their results, their character, everything. So therefore, by far the most important thing is what I make sure is neurologically close for Chance, right? How did he read? We just had lots of books around. And of course, my wife and I sometimes, but she spends more time with him, would enthusiastically read to him and just things like that. But we don't like have a stick and beat him over the head and tell him to read, or even have a time when he has to read each day or anything. Just have contextual, right, things that make what we want to be important feel important. And then the contextual approach, which is terrific and a really helpful, eye-opening recipe details that I hadn't thought of many of these, I'm sure, and I would really none of them to just tell you explicitly like he does, where he gives you all these commitments you can focus on individually as steps, and as you do that and have the value trade as you do them, then everything gets easier and easier. And it's like falling off a log to close, right? Instead of focusing on what you say when you close, right? What you say when you close somebody, if you do things contextually in the right way with the right commitments ahead of time. It's like when you're married and you're trying to have romance or intimacy. People have different contexts in their marriage, but if you have a good relationship, or marriage or not, right, then intimacy might be as simple as, hey, do you want to hop into bed, or hey, do you want to go have a romantic dinner, or whatever you have in mind. Right? It's just as simple as that. It's not, you don't like sit around reading a sales book on what to say to the person to get them to go out to dinner with you or to hop into bed with you, right? It's determined by the previous context. And if you have it good, then everything's easy, right? Because I pay such attention to context and importance in my relationships, then really anything that I want out of them is quite easy, relatively speaking. Let me actually just read for a little bit here. He says, the easiest or most difficult commitment, right? This is about asking for the money. If you haven't done everything necessary to have earned the right to ask your client to give you their business, you have made closing unnecessarily difficult. Maybe you are uncomfortable asking your prospective clients to make the commitment to change. That's a prior commitment. There's like a bullet point, for example. Maybe you believe because you have a contact or two engaged with you that the decision to change has already been made. In other words, so he's saying that maybe you're assuming because someone's talking to you a few times, that person is committed to changing. And what he's saying is they may not have committed to changing. They might feel a little bit of dissonance, like maybe they want to change, but they haven't committed to it. And therefore, hopping over to the close is going to be very difficult in what he's saying, because you haven't already gotten the contextual thing that's like a stepping stone, which is them feeling committed to change. And then he goes on to say countless opportunities are never closed because the salesperson didn't gain this commitment. Another bullet point under this idea. Perhaps you don't really want to collaborate on a solution, right? Because I think one of his commitments is about collaborating. I read the book and gone back over it, but I don't have it all memorized, of course. The commitment to collaborate, yeah, is the fourth commitment. Perhaps you don't really want to collaborate on a solution, choosing instead to show your prospect your very best idea, strongly believing you know exactly how to get them the results they need. Maybe you don't want their input. Every day, prospects refuse offers because they don't match their needs. By the way, another good thing about this book is, in the sense that it matches your situation, is that he's focused on business-to-business sales. With some other people, even Jordan Belfort, I think his main thing that he sold, like on Wolf of Wall Street, that was depicted on Wolf of Wall Street, was salesperson to like kind of fish sales, right? Like kind of in poker, there's like a fish where you get the people that are most naive or whatever, and they're not really sophisticated. Not that business people are that sophisticated about what you're doing, but business-to-business sales is a little bit different than non-business-to-business sales. And so this recipe is particularly applies to business. Next, he says, maybe you're scared to death to build consensus. That's another one of his commitments, commitment to build consensus. Oh, you may or may not run into this, but if you're dealing with, pretty much all of his sales involve situations where there's like a board of directors, right? You're often dealing with small business owners, but he's more dealing with larger businesses. And there's a bunch of stakeholders involved, or board members, or whoever, committee members. And so in his case, if you don't work with them and build a consensus with everybody involved, then you're going to be screwed. And you might have that on a smaller scale. If there's a business partner or a spouse that might get in your way, then you might want to take that into account. That might be invisible to you. You might not get feedback. That's where you're being blocked. So you want to be proactively aware that if there's anyone involved in the consensus. One thing I also keep in mind, even if it's a solo person, you can think of it like a consensus with that person's self in terms of they want to feel smart. And so there's a little conversation going on in their head, and they need to have the proper justification where they feel smart with their decision. They need to not be second-guessing themselves later. And so you can think of the consensus that way a little bit. You can't explicitly say, I want to make sure you have a consensus with your little inner skeptic, but you can still find a way to deal with that, a little more of an implicit way, and then also try to get a sense of, you can either ask them, or sometimes they're not even going to want to admit that that they need to impress their spouse, or at least none of their spouse roll their eyes at them for going with you. And so you can at least have an awareness of that and start to build a strategy that deals with that if and when it comes up. And then he says, discussing the investment before we get to contracts. Forget about it. So I'm not quite sure what he's saying. Oh, I know. He talks about how much it's going to cost early in the process, in the commitment to invest. He says if you don't do that, then you're going to end up competing on price, that they're going to end up comparing your price to others unless you tell them early on that you're a value price kind of thing, and then you can be talking about why you might cost more than some other options. Otherwise, you won't be able to do that early. And so he has the commitment to invest that you get, which is different than a commitment to decide. A commitment to invest is the sixth one. Then there's review, resolve concerns, and then decide. All right. So the idea of investing in, if he can provide a valuable solution, is it worth the investment? And you can read the book, obviously, and so you can see what he has to say, but I'm just giving you a sense. So what he writes about that here is discussing the investment before we get to contracts, by which he means, did you get the commitment to invest early before getting to the close? And then he's saying what an objector would say. He's not saying this, is opposite of what he's saying. Forget about it. Why bring up that topic, the topic of pricing, before you absolutely must? So you say, now he's disagreeing with the person arguing with him, but if you don't want to lose to a lower price competitor or discount, buck up and talk about the investment. And then I'm actually going to continue to read just a couple pages here. There's a way that I think by talking to you about what he says about closing, then it will help tie things together for you and motivate you to read the whole thing. Again, here he's talking about the 9th out of 10 commitments, and this is the commitment to give you the money. And so I'm just reading right now for a second. Here's the thing. If you don't gain all the commitments you need leading up to this point, and let me interject something, the commitments that you need for an SEO sale, or on your website, you can do something analogous to this to some degree, to a good degree. This can give you insight on website conversion as well, for sure. Your commitments might be different than his commitments to some degree, right? There's going to be rough similarities for sure. But you don't have to interpret gaining all the commitments you need to be the exact ones that he lists. But he is definitely correct in the sense of, if you don't gain all the commitments that you need leading up to this point, you are increasing the likelihood of hearing no. That's basically necessarily true, what he just said there. You haven't done what was necessary to have earned an easy yes. I like the idea of easy in the sense, and he means it in the good sense, of like conflict-free. I talk about win, then attack, right? I don't mean like the path of least resistance in the sense of like the fool's path of least resistance. I don't want to be like water going downhill until I get trapped in a basin. But easy in the sense of no conflict because you've taken care of the context is something I look for. If I have a plan and there's not a certain way that it's easy, that it involves a bunch of conflict, conflict generally ends up being a symptom of trying to convince yourself in a false way that gray is black or white. Okay, I'm going to continue reading. You can have a few discovery meetings, provide a proposal, and then hear nothing for weeks or months because your dream client hasn't committed to change. For example, that's one of the commitments, right, early on. Your pipeline may have a number of opportunities. Your pipeline is like your list of prospects, your kind of Rolodex. May have a number of opportunities that fall into this category, and now you know why. Like these prospects you think of as opportunities, but they're not going anywhere. But they haven't committed, for example, to change. Probably that commitment to change and the idea of trading value for time are two of the big parts of this recipe you're going to want to incorporate for yourself, for sure. And I have some more to say about that in a little while, if I remember, but presumably I will. You might have the perfect solution, but if your prospective client believes there is a better solution, remember I said perceived value, right? It doesn't matter if you have the perfect solution in and of itself. You need something different than that ultimately. Obviously, you don't want to lead someone to a product that's bad, and obviously you want the reality to be as good as possible. However, it's not enough. So again, he says you might have the perfect solution, but if your prospective client believes there is a better solution, one that takes into account the things they want, you are going to hear no when you ask for the business, deservedly so. So although he may or may not use my exact phraseology of perceived value, he really nails it here with perceived value. Right? And there you go, a successful salesperson, he knows to make that distinction between perceived value and actual value. And remember, actual value, you're not omniscient yourself. So we're really talking about perceived value to you versus perceived value to them in a sense, right? Sure, there can be some things you can know, right? I get that. But in terms of things that you just make sure you're not doing something that's actually going to hurt somebody, right? And then that can be, that boundary is fine. You can certainly make money without hurting people. All right. He goes on, you may not want to offend the contact you're working with by insisting that you bring the rest of their team into the conversation. That's the consensus thing. May or may not apply to you, but it's cool to see his thinking about this and his uncompromising attitude about context, right? People, again, they want to think, oh, I'll just ignore that context. It's easy to ignore now. I'll just be so cool later. And actually, people get juiced. The wrong type of thinking. They're trying to make the gray area black and white, with like in a false way, fabricated way. It leads people to actually, does this sound familiar, either in yourself or people that do this, they like the idea that something's a greater challenge because then that proves in the moment that they're awesome. People want to believe that they can succeed in the moment. They want to believe they're James Bond, who you throw them a whole new challenge and they succeed the first time, or James Bond would pretty much die, right? A million times over if he didn't go into a new situation and rock right off the bat, or that without a lot of context, he could just kiss the woman and instead of what's going on these days, they just swoon, right, instead of get on Twitter, smash them. Anyhow, so people actually, with the wrong type of thinking, but that everyone has by default, is they actually like the idea of having all these obstacles against them and then overcoming it and proving they can overcome obstacles, but better to prove that you're smart by resolving obstacles contextually. And then whenever I win, I hardly ever get credit much, because by the time I win, it looks like I almost did nothing. And the contextual stuff that I do looks wrong or like I'm not doing anything. And then I win and it looks like I just got lucky or stumbled or just got something really easy. And it's pretty funny, right? It takes like years often of someone being with me to catch on. And even then, they can, Mike caught on at a certain point, like big time, and then it was pretty great. I'm sure I can make a comment about that and I'll look at later. Okay, I'll reread this paragraph. You may not want to offend the contact you are working with by insisting that you bring the rest of their team into the conversation. But when your proposal is put in front of the stakeholders you've neglected, and it's the first time they've seen it, you can expect they will forcefully reject it. This is true even when what you sell will benefit them. By neglecting these stakeholders, you have proved you don't care about them. You see how wise this author is, right, in terms of context? Such a good example of paying proper attention to context. And he's so unflinching and generally people don't want to ask the stakeholders to get in there because people want to feel like they're making progress and they end up in that local basin, right? They take the path of least resistance. What's the least resistance? Not insisting the other stakeholders get in the room. That's the least resistance. Then what do? You end up in a puddle, right? You end up in a local basin like water. It follows the path of least resistance and then it ends up not necessarily at the bottom of the hill. It ends up in a little local basin that it'll get stuck in because then it has to go up and out. I'm reading now. Your solution is going to cost what it costs, no matter when you disclose the amount. Your price doesn't drop the longer you hide it. It just creates greater sticker shock. I know what you're thinking. Quote, I want to build the value of the solution so they believe it's worth the investment. The problem with that approach is that if you are more expensive than your competitors, you aren't being compared against the greater value you create. You're being compared against competitive offerings and alternatives. It's easier to sell your higher price by justifying the investment earlier. You'll also find out you won't have to discount your solution nearly as often or as much when you build the value throughout the process. I know I'm just reading out of a book to you guys for a little while, but of course the value that you're getting from me is which book I'm reading and which page of that book, right, out of many alternatives, and explaining, of course, context around it. Continuing for a little while. You make it easy to ask for the commitment to buy from you when you gain all the necessary commitments before you ask for the commitment to decide. You just talked about close. The commitment to decide is the close. By asking for and obtaining the more difficult commitments you need throughout the sales process. They might be more difficult in a sense, but they're timely, right? They make sense at the time. That's my interjection there. But by asking for and obtaining the more difficult commitments you need throughout the sales process, you make asking for this final decision one of the easiest decisions to obtain. By avoiding these commitments, you make it more difficult. And then in subtitle or bigger text, how to ask for the commitment to decide. I'll just read you a little bit what he says about this, and then that'll be all I read to you from this book. But I think reading you a little bit of it, I think it's making a big difference in terms of helping you to understand why to get through the whole book with this guy. All right, so how to ask for the commitment to decide. He's going to give you some actual language to use and what not to use. I'm reading. I don't have to tell you how important it is to get a yes to this commitment or how good it feels to win a new client. This is a big deal. That being said, there's no reason to think that this ask requires special techniques or tactics. Right? What do I say? Win, then attack. The attack doesn't require special tactics because you've already won ahead of time. This is his way of saying that. Just be yourself. Now, I always say, whenever people say be yourself, make sure yourself is at least up to par, right? But overall, just be yourself and treat your, but if you're smart enough to get the first 8 commitments, then whoever you are as being yourself should, in fact, like he's saying, be plenty, right? Just be if you're having trouble getting the first 8 commitments, then it'll help you get a sense, it'll break things down for you much better in terms of identifying bottlenecks or what's wrong with your process, or it'll be much easier if you're having a problem with, again, some of these commitments you might not need, but just for the sake of argument, if you need to get the other 8 commitments during the course of your communications with a client, if you're having trouble with the third one, it'll be more easy for you to pinpoint where the issue is than if you're just trying to get them to decide and you don't realize the other ones, and it's so much more open-ended where your bottleneck might be, right, or what's wrong with you or your process or what you're saying. So this really helps give you the right questions to ask about what you're doing wrong, so to speak, if you feel like you're not getting the results you want. I'm not assuming any one of you is actually doing anything wrong, but you know what I mean. Okay, so he says just be yourself and treat your prospective client the same way you've treated her throughout the sales process. Use natural language, he says. Memorizing special closing techniques, and this flies in the face of a lot of sales training. Memorizing special closing techniques or using tactical approaches will just sound false to your prospect and erode her trust. And remember, for us in our niche, trust is paramount. In some other, and that's of course the case with a lot of products, but it's not the case with every product. So, for example, when SEO was more new, it was more about educating a person to how to what SEO is, and that wouldn't it be great to have a lot of leads, or you're missing out on a lot of leads, right? When businesses, as the years go by, they have more of an idea about what it is to some degree. I'm not saying every business owner knows a lot, right? But they have some more sense than they used to 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So therefore, the idea of who to trust is more of an issue than in the past, where you could more just like point out this new thing and how it works, and trust was less of an issue. Okay, so special closing techniques and tactical approaches can erode trust, and that's particularly important for us. Okay, I'm reading some more. So ask for her business in your own natural language and be as direct as possible. You might say, quote, I believe we've done everything we've needed to do up to this point, and unless you believe we need to do something else, I'd like to ask you for your business. Can we get started? Great. If you listen to one of my sales webinars I've done recently for OMG, right, our program, then you'll notice that when I ask people to buy, I'm not using any real special sales techniques. Right, so this is in alignment with how I do things as well. I talk overall about the understanding line, and so I'm looking for people to understand somebody, get a sense of bottlenecks, what's important to them, And by the time that I'm asking to work with them, I basically just say, so do you want to do this? So I do this as well. I can testify to you that it works, it's plausible, and it's how I actually do things myself. Just like I say, win then attack. By the time I'm attacking, it doesn't hardly look like I'm attacking. It looks like I'm just taking one easy step forward, or reaching out and taking a hold of something that's right there. He goes on to say there's nothing tactical. See, he used the word tactical similar to how I use it too. Tactical, like strategy, is contextual, generally, like to be simplistic. And tactical is what you do in the moment, right, like outside of context. And he de-emphasizes tactics in favor of strategy, and I agree. Of course, all things being equal, you'd rather have better tactics rather than worse tactics, right? But really, you don't want to rely on the moment. Why? Because you can't use black and white thinking very well in the moment. In other words, you have less conscious impact. You just, obviously, there's just less in your favor if you're relying on the moment. Even if you think you're relying on the moment, all you're doing, you're always acting on your current level of understanding and lack thereof in the moment, period. People that take pride in acting in the moment are just trying to prove to themselves that they already know. They're just trying to reinforce their own arrogance, and it's a self-defeating cycle. All right. So he says there's nothing tactical, tricky, or manipulative about this approach. Here's another way to put it. Quote, can we begin putting this solution in place for you now? Another tricky statement he gives you, but that's, again, some exact words he gives you in a good way. Or you can say, he said, this is reading again, I think we've addressed all of your concerns and have a good plan in place. All we need to get started is your approval and a signed agreement. Does this work for you? Great. All right, let's have a little bit of fun here. What not to say. Whatever you do, be sure to avoid using any coy, convoluted, or tricky approaches when asking for your prospect's business. And by the way, let me interject something. By far the thing that you don't want is vagueness, blurriness, confusion, right, and so forth. That will for sure be counterproductive every time when it comes to sales. Some people, but there's a way that people act on the opposite idea often because clarity seems like it can be counterproductive at times, right, or get in the way. Just like the commitment for consensus, if there's other stakeholders, it's blurry not to involve them, right? It's vague and confusing, but it can feel like it's easier. It's the path of least resistance. So it's more of a trap than it might seem to be vague or blurry about agreements. Here are a few examples of what not to say. He says, here's one example of a script of not to say. If I could provide you with this solution at this price, is there anything that would prevent you from doing business? I think he's actually just directly, it seems like he's replying almost to Jordan Belfort here, weirdly enough, because I think that's not like an exact thing, but I might be off on that. Mike's gone through Jordan's training pretty closely, so I'm not sure. And I'm not trying to tell you which is right or wrong exactly there, but I'm just pointing out this author seems like he has an issue with the Wolf of Wall Street method, and he's giving his own perspective. And I'd like you to obviously have alternative perspectives. So I'll read it again. The quote that he says, what not to say. If I could provide you with this solution at this price, is there anything that would prevent you from doing business with me? And then the author now, Iannarino, now explains, this isn't a close. It's not even a request for a commitment. It's the kind of language a salesperson uses when he's afraid of asking for a commitment. He's asking to resolve concerns while simultaneously suggesting that another price is available, which opens the possibility of negotiation and can make the prospect worry that the investment may be too high. Next, is my company the kind of company you want to work with? Am I the kind of salesperson you want to work with? If money wasn't an issue, would you buy this right now? And this is where I particularly noticed that I think he's directly disagreeing with Jordan, because Jordan talks about they have to believe in your company and so forth. I'm not myself saying that I disagree. I think that's why I made the distinction earlier about business-to-business sales versus selling to fish, or kind of people that are naive relative to your industry that you're selling. I think that there's a way to sell to those people. And then these things that Iannarino is objecting to might work for that, and especially in the short term. But that in business-to-business sales and with people that are more sophisticated, not that a lot of your prospects are necessarily that sophisticated, but still, he gives a real good point about what you're implying here. Right, about the other one. Anyway, so again, what he said not to say, is my company the kind of company you want to work with? Am I the kind of salesperson you want to work with? If money wasn't an issue, would you buy this? And now his explanation for why not to say that is, tie-downs like these are self-oriented and intentionally manipulative. A bad salesperson asked me these questions once, And I said yes to the first and no to the second, noting that money wasn't an issue. The second is, are you the kind of salesperson I want to work with? Is yes, your company is the kind of company, but you're not the kind of salesperson I want to work with, and no, money's not an issue. Obviously, that wasn't the outcome he expected. But he made the choice to use this poor closing language, so I made the choice to reject that language with extreme prejudice. That might work in some cases, what he's saying is wrong, but I agree with him overall. I think that Iannarino's philosophy approach, foundational, he gets the foundation right with value, he gets the overall contextual focus right instead of focusing on tactics and what you do in the moment. And so I would go with Iannarino. Next, of what not to say. When should we get started? Iannarino explains. This is another way to avoid asking directly for a prospect's business. The hope is that the prospect will respond right away, but more likely the answer will be, let me think about it. And then another one. And the next one is actually one that an acquaintance of mine did use successfully to sell some SEO, or no, to sell a website services, not SEO actually. But Iannarino explains why he thinks it's suboptimal. And again, I tend to think that Iannarino has wisdom here. Of course, these things he's saying, what not to say, have worked at some point in the past, but I think his approach is better. Okay, and here's what it is. The script, and then he'll explain. The script of what not to say is, if you buy today, I can discount our proposal by X amount and give you an extra service at no, and that's in brackets, whatever that service might be. I'll give you an extra thing, a bonus at no additional cost. Does that sound good to you? Iannarino says this might work in an infomercial, but it's an abysmal approach for a professional salesperson. He says in parentheses, I actually cringed when I typed that approach. If a prospect agrees to buy, it should be because of the good work you've done, not because you're offering a discount or giving away freebies. And then the final thing, I'll just read the rest of the page, and then I'll be done reading. But I think we're having fun here, reading the forward, I guess. Usually, of course, I don't just read to you guys, but in this case, I think it works well. If you've gained all the commitments you need, it's almost certain that you can expect yes, and that you earned it. Your confidence in asking your prospective client for his business can be directly proportional to your confidence in the work you've done up to this point. And then one more subheadline here. What if they say no? What if they say no when you've asked correctly? What if you say, I believe we've done everything we need to do up to this point, and unless you believe we need to do something else, I'd like to ask you for your business. Can we get started? Let's say you've done the commitments. You say that, and they say no. Of course, it's always possible that your dream client will say no to going forward with your solution. It happens. That's because selling is more akin to mixed martial arts than it is to boxing. In boxing, world champions may go undefeated for decades. But in mixed martial arts, you can be a world champion having won 5 fights and lost 5 fights. By the way, Magic the Gathering is like that too. You just don't win all the time, even when you're top of the world. Losses are expected, even if you hate losing, Iannarino says. If your prospective client says no, it's quite likely that she'll follow it with a reason. Not a problem. If she needs to do or have something else before moving forward, help her to do it or get it if at all possible. If she doesn't give you a reason, be prepared to say, if you aren't ready to move forward, that means we haven't done something we still need to do, or something has changed on your end. Can you share with me what you're thinking? Then, that was a quote, but now he's saying, don't get defensive, act surprised, or let on that you're unhappy that you didn't get what you wanted. Something went wrong. You need to find out what it is and try to do whatever you can to make it right. Okay, that's all I'll read. Let me go to the discussion for a little bit. Let me actually take a 1-minute break, and I will come right back. Hey guys, how are you liking it? How are you doing over here? This is pretty awesome, right? And let me ask you this: Am I fulfilling or making progress with fulfilling what I said? We're going to get you over the finish line with whatever your next finish line is with dimensionality. Are we making progress on that? I'm just going to skip to the end for a moment. Cool. You like it, Bob? Excellent. I'm glad. And Bob knows his conversion and sales, right? Mike likes it. Good. Can always count on Mike. Mike, I'd love having it. Helpful? Great, Nathan, good. And did me reading a little bit, did it help give you even more clarity and motivation on reading the book? Because we can often start to read. Act now, we'll throw in a free wish. That's great. You like, oh great, you like Our Brain Determines Important based on neurological closeness, boom. Terrific to review that, thanks Julie. And I'll go back up in a minute, but fabulous, great, wow, a lot of great. Good stuff, I like the clarification, absolutely, love your insights. Great, I'm getting as much credit as Iannarino, that's great. I'm just having fun. Trading commitments for value seems like a good framework for creating funnels, would you agree? Yeah, absolutely, because you asked about website conversion as well, Adrian, and this book can definitely apply to that. Yeah, you want to think, looking at how he breaks down commitments is eye-opening because he comes up with a lot of them. And so when you're thinking about a website opt-in, for example, giving their email, you want to also think in terms of it's not just one commitment, and so you want to earn each of them. Something that we're going to transition into as email changes a little bit and so forth with smartphones and the way people interface with it to some degree. I was talking about it with Mike and then had the thought that we're going to do a weekly rundown, and that the first thing that new prospects to OMG will opt into is just getting on an email list for only a once-a-week email rundown. Now, several years ago, I wouldn't have done it that way. It would have been defensive years ago to be like, we're only going to email you once a week. But I think in this day and age with smartphones where you get pinged all the time and it doesn't sort emails as much as well, smaller screen and all that, then I think for starters, knowing that it's specifically a one weekly rundown and what they're going to get from that, and it will be helpful for the opt-in and that'll actually prevent us from having to do a double opt-in on those where they confirm, because that's a little harder to get these days too with all the ways that people interface with email. So I bring that up because just getting an email is not the only thing you're trying to get, even in that one step. You're trying to get them to commit, perhaps to double confirm, where they get a confirmation email and they click, or where they're committing then to start taking a look at your emails and take them seriously. Next, as you email them and communicate, if you do, but I'm using this as an example, whether or not it applies to you is the exact detail or not, then you're looking for the commitment to at least be checking your subject headlines. I keep that in mind. I'm like, okay, after maybe I'll get a honeymoon period for a couple emails, but then, and maybe I won't, but if I do, but then I want to be building in those first few emails, I want at least to get them to commit, so to speak. Of course, it's not the same as a person-to-person actual commitment, but I want to get them to feel like there's a reason for them to at least check the subject headlines so that I at least can ping somebody that way, that if I come up with a subject headline that applies to them, that they'll click it. I want to at least get that, and that's a great place, like a semi-soft lock, right? Like the idea of finding that threshold point that you're going for that's pretty easy to get if you really go for it, where I'm not necessarily getting them to read and open every email forever right in the beginning, but if I'm getting them to continue to look at the subject headlines, things like that. So multiple commitments right at that opt-in, and then pretty soon after that, within the next couple emails, you're trying to get them to kind of commit to continuing to at least look at your subject headlines, whether or not they click in and read every one. Of course, it'd be great to instead get them to commit to read every word of every one of your emails, but that's ignoring the semi-soft lock idea of going for a smaller result that as long as you have it, all you have to do is be competent and you'll win. If they're going to check our subject headlines, at least, then I'm fine. I can win with competence after that by often enough having subject lines that might be relevant to them when I want to. Great, just ordered the book, says Zach. Bob said I bought the Kindle version, super. Just bought, just now? Excellent. Love these book shares. Yeah, you like the, I don't sometimes let you guys know what I'm reading. I mentioned I'm reading Sway now, S-W-A-Y, and I've talked about books like Subliminal and so forth, and those are different. Those aren't on sale specifically, although it's related. Understanding how people make decisions, which there's a bunch of books like that, like with Sway and so forth. They'll be presented as why people are like irrational, or how people's subliminal mind controls their thinking and things like that more than we think. But really, it's about decision making, and combined with what I talk about, it'll be interesting in terms of details to get books like Sway or Subliminal. Or you can just basically look. I'll pull one more down. Social was actually recommended to me by one of you guys. I'm sorry that I forgot which one. Was it Jennifer Glidden or Julie or someone? Might have been. Seems almost as wise as you, David Mills, in this matter, at least. Certainly in this matter. Yeah, exactly. I agree. I was really impressed, super impressed. It's the first sales book I've shared. So Social is fun to read. These are just in the other thing. They're Subliminal. There's The Righteous Mind is another. It's just the same type of book like Sway, where they're talking about the decision-making process, like psychological experiments showing how people don't think how they think and things like that, and where they behave irrationally. They call it irrationally. The irony of when they say that people behave irrationally, or the irony of anyone thinking that, is people don't seem to realize that if you think that other people are behaving irrationally, then perhaps your model for the world, for the mind, is off. I don't really look at it like people behave exactly irrationally. Another way to put it is, I'm not surprised by it because there's no such thing except for irrationality until and unless you correctly address the question of epistemology, which people don't do. So there's no such thing as people being rational. without that. So it shouldn't be a surprise that you find symptoms of irrationality. As a matter of fact, you should be surprised if someone was ever actually rational, which they're not. They, of course, act correctly on certain premises. But the root of everybody's thinking is an abyss of nonsense until and unless they redesign it, which realistically, if someone hasn't taken 5, 10, 20 years and really worked on it consistently and is really good at it, then it would be a surprise if they figured it out. They might, but they also would be surprised. But someone's not probably just going to trip over a log and design the right answer to epistemology for themselves. On the other hand, we're given a lifespan of, what, 70, 80, 90 years in many cases. So if something takes 5 or 10 years, then God certainly made it very possible for everybody. Bryce said, explanation is awesome with dimensionality. This is better than audiobook. Great. Yeah, exactly. It was fun to read a little bit and give the commentary just a bit. Cody says, it's really wonderful, David. Perfect timing for right now. Yeah, this book's probably perfect timing for everyone because we all, I'm pretty sure everyone either wants to take their business to the next level, whatever that is, or get started. Mike Long said, I discuss our vision for the weekly rundown. Great, in your latest email. So you can look at Mike's latest email there. Brian says, currently working on JB straight line selling. Yeah, Jordan Belfort's. What and where do you find the similarities and differences? Again, I think they can both work. When I heard Jordan, there's plenty of great things that he said. He obviously has had plenty of success selling. There's just a number of things that Iannarino is going to open your eyes to. I would let Iannarino and myself set the overall frame for understanding sales, and then use Belfort to help you with specific tactics that can fit into that. But I wouldn't let Jordan necessarily set the frame. If I were to take a wild guess, and I really don't know the answer to this, but I would guess that Iannarino's private, personal life is in pretty good shape. And I might be wrong as heck about that, of course, but he has a pretty decent likelihood, it seems to me. See, I did not know this ahead of time. It says he lives with his family in Westerville, Ohio. What you'll find with highly tactical salespeople is they'll tend to have problems in their personal relationships because it's all part of the same process. You can sell, if you're selling based on transferring certainty, then the path of least resistance, which your mind is going to generally follow, right? The associatively close path is self-delusion. And many of the seemingly great conversion gurus are just very delusional people. And I know a fair amount of them being in my niche. And they have trouble with personal relationships, but they seem very compelling. And they often don't even know when they are, there's a constant kind of lack of integrity that when you know how to look for it, you'll find it. And once you look for it, but they'll come across as so certain, because they actually are. But there's a certain type of switch that's off in certain people's mind that actually makes them in the short term much better at selling than like a normal person. With Iannarino, and then they'll teach how to sell, and then a lot of people won't duplicate the results and no one will know why. And now I'm explaining it to you. With Iannarino, everyone can get results. And with what I'm telling you, which is, of course, they complement each other very well, and they're all part of the same philosophy regarding sales. I don't know that he's revamped his epistemological approach to life, right? However, but he probably does pretty well with just his general life and personal life. Again, but I want you to understand that self-delusion really does sell, and it sells better than the middle ground of neither building the context properly. Like if you're not going to self-delude yourself, and unless you have something off about your personality in a certain way, you can't do it the way these highly successful salespeople in a certain way, these highly successful short-term type of selling people, that's how they do it. And they really have this, and they really do it this way. It's probably shocking a lot of you as I say this, but at the same time resonating, right? I've been aware of this for years. The rest of us can't do it that way. And so the only way that can work is a contextual approach, but nearly all the people selling about sales and looking, the ones that we're drawn to like moths to a flame, are these people with this thing off where they're deluded and they're self-delusional, but they come across as so certain that everyone's looking for certainty, right, out of the gray, but they don't want to do it. And so the neurological path of closeness and so forth, we're going to be drawn to these people, and they're going to make money, which is going to reinforce that they're successful and they do well and you should follow them. And it's all a circular trap, basically. And the place to look tends to be their personal life for a clue, but you can also just tell directly from observing them after a little while. Great. Julie said, I feel like I'm being hit over the head with things I've previously heard you say many times. Example, self-delusion is often the path of least resistance. Oh my God, excellent, good. Joseph says, can you give me a definition of meta in relation to running in parallel with strategy? Basically, when I say meta, it's like another frame. Like thinking about value is somewhat of a meta idea to more specific ideas of sales, maybe. Meta means you have an outer frame or box that helps you understand what's inside of it, and that might be a little bit vague. I know I should be able to give a zillion different examples. You can read a whole lot of relationship advice too, right, which is somewhat like it touches on things that can overlap with sales. And people that have the delusional type of sales will often be teaching and be good at like pickup. They'll create standards and benchmarks for themselves that have to do with amount rather than longevity and so forth, right? So how many people they sleep with, how much money they make, how many sales they make, things like that, because they can churn through and that way. To understand a meta idea with relationships has to do also with a certain type of value, but you need to make the transition to be successful in relationships to placing value in a shared creation that you're making with somebody else, whether a business venture situation or a mission, a war even, or of course in a romantic relationship what you're creating, and in a relationship with your children, what you're creating together, versus status, versus personal value. People that don't make the transition from personal value, status type stuff, literally people that don't make the transition, it's like they're stuck in high school in their head. They think they're doing their relationship partner in business or romance, or even if they have kids, they think that they're doing those people a favor by increasing their own perceived personal value, including they can literally be cutting down the people they're in a relationship with and undermining them. You'll even see this sometimes, often with spouses. People can even get married and be having this problem all the time. They'll undercut the other person, and they'll feel to themselves like they actually did everyone a favor, because now they have more personal value relative to the other person because they cut the other person down, and they think that means that they're better, like they're a more valuable relationship partner by cutting down the other person. Or they'll just set their own benchmarks for themselves and the other person. They'll just say, this is what determines a person's value, their status. And they'll just come up with stuff that they're good at. And they'll act, and then people get drawn into that because they'll feel that delusion so powerfully that they'll be sure of it. They'll be like certain that this is the yardstick, right? And the relationship partner will get drawn into that and feel like, yeah, I got to compete and I got to prove to this guy that I can compete on that yardstick. But the person, the delusional person, the status person, just picked a yardstick. Or they'll both be delusional often, and they'll both be thinking in terms of status, because the person who thinks in terms of creation value, co-creating something of value, and getting the value in a relationship off of that is hopefully not going to stay in a relationship. But they can get trapped. They can get confused and trapped, and they don't know what happens. And they get sucked into this status, personal value thing, where literally I say literally because it's so foreign to me at this point, but it's so much ingrained in a lot of people's minds. And it's so, this idea, if we could just spread this one idea, the world would be improved beyond belief. Just so it's meta to some things, and it's not, and then the overall understanding of the world that I give you about net happiness and stuff is meta to all this. But what I'm saying is meta to relationships. People that are stuck in this personal value trap, they think that they define loyalty as they can do anything. They can even cheat, sleep with other people, whatever. And as long as they also stay in a relationship with their partner, they feel like they're being loyal. And they'll be sure of it themselves. Like they can't even comprehend that they're not being loyal. They'll sleep with whoever or cheat in whatever way is analogous in business, whatever. And they're like, cheating will actually increase their idea of personal value, because they'll make their conquests or their accomplishments or the money they're making as the benchmark of status and value. By cheating, they literally, in their head, increase their own value by their own circular standard. And so now, by staying in a relationship with the person they're with, business or personal, they'll think that they're doing the person even more of a favor. So when they cheat, they actually feel like they're benefiting the person that they're cheating on in their head. And that's why they keep doing it, and they stay in that trap. And people stay in this, and people just get so trapped in this. I explain it both because the idea itself really matters, but realizing wow, there are these things in life that we can realize that are these meta concepts that people spend their whole lives trapped in this, either as a victim or they're both kind of victims, right? Even the person that's doing it in the sense of status, they're a victim of that meme, that idea. As a being, they're a victim of they're trapped. Eye-opening, isn't that crazy? And you'll definitely run into that in business, right? And so knowing to look for that. And then knowing now to parse out sales advice when people are talking about certainty and a lot of tactics, it's mostly this self-delusion thing that if you're not good at that, then it's going to be hard to duplicate. And it takes more work, so to speak, to do it this way that Iannarino talks about, or that I talk about, but it's the only route. The only thing that doesn't take work is being inherently having something off about your personality where you can believe a self-deluding thing really easily and fast and well, which again, it would cause you all kinds of problems. And you're also just going to long-term make less money. I have such an easy time, relatively speaking, making a lot of money. Like, you know what's funny is I don't even try to calculate like a ROI, like return on investment or expected value of a customer or a prospect. It's a nonsense concept to me because I routinely have like infinitely lasting relationships. I can't think of it's happened in my distant past, but I can't think of any relationship that I've had in years and years that I've wanted to continue it and it's split. Every split that I've had has been my end. Oh, now, of course, some prospects or customers, I would rather they maybe stayed. And so if you count those, then of course we have drop off. But relatively speaking, we have tremendous longevity with our prospects and members and so forth. And so the very idea of trying to calculate a value would be impossible because it would just keep increasing every new week. I'd have to recalculate my number. So it's so high that I can't even try to do, how much should I pay for an ad? Pretty much I guess hundreds of dollars if I was going to go that route. Whereas someone who's self-delusional is going to churn, and then they have to build a whole life and business model around churn. Okay. Great. See if I missed any comments earlier. Maria Shelley wrote, I love that in his breakdown, Iannarino includes paying more attention to customers' needs rather than earning money, all a process equals same as Jamie Washington. Absolutely. Yeah, Mark, Kirk, Jamie, I'm intentionally, the people I'm getting on, there's a common thread, right, of course. Great. David's advice on alchemy to become your first product is so powerful. I've seen people really struggle, not just Mike commented when I was talking about how important it is to have a clear picture of what fulfillment is going to look like when you're selling a product. I've seen people really struggle not just making a sale, but almost worse is making a sale and feeling frozen afterwards, Mike says. And I've seen that happen. Of course, in OMG, you'll get out of it, he says, with Greg's help, but pointing out that it hurts your sales in the first place, your sales process, if you don't have a clear idea of how you're going to fulfill. Great. Levi said he ordered the book. Super. And obviously, I just gave you the name of the book, not an Amazon link. It could have, I'm not an affiliate link. Don't need money that badly. If I did, I'd probably just sell you black hat links and with a huge markup. Good way to make money. Righty, great. Okay, those are the comments. All right. I tripped over a log and broke my default epistemology. That's great. I hate churn, says Julie. Oh, yeah, and Mark Kirk said that. He doesn't get much churn. And that's an indication of someone who's, the only way you're not going to get much churn is if you are using the same philosophy. It's the only way. And if you build churn into your business on purpose, then that's somebody who is using the opposite philosophy. They might come up with a lot of good tactics. The people who excel based on delusion, you can actually learn plenty from them. And they come up with lots of good tactics. Remember, it's funny when you trace the logic of all this, people that ignore context and have all kinds of problems in their lives, when they do something well, then you actually really want to pay attention, right? I'll sometimes get you in front of people like that, right? So they ignore context, they're arrogant, delusional, and then they have a big success. Whatever they're doing to have that success, there's probably a lot of really good tactics in there, if it's exactly what you're doing, that you can learn from, right? Because they've ignored context, and so they were so ridiculous that way that whatever they did do as tactics must be awesome, right? I wouldn't want to rely on that person again in a different situation, but they have something to teach you. And I pointed this out to Mike plenty of times. I said, hey, this person must have a lot to teach us tactically with this thing if it's exactly the same thing we're doing. Because they got to be doing something right tactically if they're going to be acting that way otherwise. Right? We deal with that in affiliates and so forth, certain people in our niche and so forth. But if you trace how it all works, it all fits together. My whole model for things, the more we communicate it, the more it'll all fit together and make sense and reinforce itself. And the world will surprise you less and less. Okay, I'll wrap things up here pretty soon. Third thing I wrote here is navigating categories, and meaning that I've talked about conversion in terms of that you're basically navigating categories until it's like a combination lock that you need to figure out regarding what you're doing. What categories do you need to be in, right? You need to probably be in us in a lot of cases. In other words, kind of part of the in group that person is focused on at the time. There's all kinds of different in groups and out groups depending on what a person is currently associated with. Remember the experiment I've shared with you at one point where you can take, for example, I think it's Asian women. I think this is the example that was actually tested. And you can give them a sort of questionnaire or some kind of interaction that has them identifying more as a woman or more as an Asian, right? You can give someone a questionnaire, ask about their nationality, whether they're second generation, first generation, whatever, where their parents are from, whatever it might be that gets them thinking in terms of, oh yeah, I'm an Asian, right? Or any ethnicity, and not ethnicity, but nationality in this case. I know that Asia is not a nation, but I'm referring to that. Anyhow, like culture, which is a specific set of context, contextual beliefs, and ways of operating that are going to lead to certain outcomes, right? Cultures are not equal with respect to certain specific results. Or, of course, you can ask people questions that get them identifying neurological closeness, right? Of course, an Asian female would identify both as an Asian or a female, ultimately, if you ask them the direct question. But which one is neurologically close based on their interactions just then, and then they'll do very different on a math test. Same person. That's interesting in and of itself for many reasons, but what can be very eye-opening for that is that a particular prospect that you're talking to can identify with all sorts of different things potentially. We get this intuitively to a good degree, right? If we have political differences, we know we don't want to discuss those, right? We're trying to make a sale. But whether you're an us or them isn't like an objective thing, and it's not necessarily permanent. It can change the next day if you reinforce it a little bit. Generally, you want to be in an us category with something that they're thinking of. I think people intuit to this, but it's easy to overlook it, but I'll point it out. Anyway, that's just one of a zillion examples of navigating categories is my overall frame with conversion. My overall frame with business is value, I would say. My overall frame with, and certainly when conversion interacts with business, then I'm talking about value. No. But for sales and conversion, I think in terms of navigating categories, you need to figure out what categories are important for a person in making a sale, and you want to click those into place. And if you're pretty sure that you've done a bunch of things right, but you're not making a sale, that you're trying to hunt down what's the category bottleneck. And Ian Arino's book, I don't know that he uses the word category, but by splitting things into commitments, then you can think of those as 10 different categories, or 8 leading up to before the close, that he has in his niche that he's done. And he's done a few, I think, but again, they might not all apply exactly to you, but it gives you a lot of great questions to ask about potential categories that you might not have gotten in place and in the right order, because you might not be able to break into a certain category until you've broken into a previous one first in some cases. So you need to think that some categories are subcategories of others, are not subcategories of others, they're just relevant in general, and they're like check boxes you have to check off. So his book can really help you, and it really goes along with the navigating categories approach, whether or not he thinks of it that way explicitly. But I want to remind you that's my overall approach to sales, is thinking in terms of navigating categories. And that gives me a sense of what questions to ask and how to look for bottlenecks. Number 4, I think I've talked about this throughout this webinar, is using a recipe and how to use it, right? And I've given you a sense. I'm trying to think if there's any more notes I want to give on that. One thing I do often want to do is copy a recipe exactly sometimes it'll often give me questions to ask and help me realize things and help my understanding. If you start to modify a recipe before you try it kind of whole cloth, then there's an implicit message of closure that you're giving to your brain. You're telling yourself, you're basically implying that you know better than the person with the recipe, and that'll be a vector that kind of closes off questions. Now at the same time, you need to balance that, and there's a way to do it even better than balancing, but with the idea that, okay, you might have a different circumstance than what they're talking about. And so you might need to modify it to the best of your ability based on your different circumstance. So let me then modify what I said. If the circumstance seems quite similar, where there's no very clear differences that are definite, right? In essence, if there's doubt, give the benefit of the doubt to following the recipe. If there's doubt or gray area and you give the benefit of the doubt to your own opinion, then you're going to be not putting yourself, you're going to be reinforcing a certain unhelpful arrogance and closure. You don't want premature closure when you're trying to solve a problem. Your mind then, your subconscious mind, whatever you want to think of it, is not going to be working on the problem, and it's not going to be creating questions in the way that you want it to in order to achieve mastery. So again, when in doubt, follow the recipe rather than trying to prove that you're smarter than the person with the recipe. It's not about who's smarter. You're going to be smarter overall by putting yourself in a position to be open and asking questions. It's not that the other person's right or not, but it's that the overall process will work better towards mastery if, when in doubt, follow the recipe in full. If there's no doubt that something's different and that something can be left out or whatever, such as if there's definitely only one principle and there's no stakeholders, you can leave out the consensus thing. Okay, so benefit of the doubt means there has to be doubt. If there's no doubt, then you don't need to give someone the benefit of the doubt because it's no longer relevant. Also, you're in a better position to recognize and use recipes the more you understand the meta, the more you understand the overall frames, which when it comes to conversion and lots of other things, I'm helping you with, right? And that's why when I recommend this book, it's an excellent book, and I can identify it as an excellent book because I understand so much of the outer meta and context and frames of such as value, contextual approach, navigating categories, right, that he talks about, that I could recognize it as a book that would be very, very helpful for you rather than just reading tactics that feel like they fit or feel like they would work well or just feel right as a good fit. Okay. Belief in progress I might put off until a future webinar. Of course, this overall webinar series talks about progress, and you can understand that overall, when I talk about, if you've heard me talk in the past about when you're selling as another overall kind of frame, it's a smaller frame than navigating categories, but it's still an overall frame, is the idea of you want to, I say, you can, in one sense, oversimplify, but in kind of a pretty useful way, a conversion process to vision and justification. Overall, what people want, what's going to give people positive emotions is things related to making progress. Generally, of course, we know pain motivates people more, etc. So that means that you can remember that a main way that people want to pay for progress is to get unstuck. But once you look at progress and being stuck and unstuck as all part of one overall idea, then you give someone a vision. But that vision revolves around a vision of progress, including being unstuck in a certain way, right? A vision of being able to make progress for yourself or something you care about, like your business or a loved one or whatever. And then, but someone has to believe in that vision. That's the justification part. So they'll want to believe in it if it involves progress, and then it's pretty easy to get them to believe in it, but you still need to justify it in some way. And depending on the niche and the market sophistication and the degree of skepticism, the justification might be harder or easier. When it comes to selling SEO, it's probably a little harder. But you can fully have that work in your favor in the sense that you just make sure you break through it, and then you'll get the sale and other people won't make the justification as well as the vision, but always do both. Okay, the vision is like the battery that you're plugging into. If there's no juice, it doesn't matter how much proof you have, right? But then you also want to have the justification once you juice things with a vision. Okay, so I actually did say a fair amount about that, so that's good. Okay, guys, I will wind things down pretty soon here. I'll take a look at the comments. Shema said, oh, another person bought. Great, making lots of free sales today. Not making any money off the sales, but of course, I say that tongue-in-cheek. Totally love. I want you guys to succeed and make progress, and that's what we're doing this. Just bought the Kindle edition, super. Shema said, this is the first time I'm really hearing about categories from you. Could you give me some examples? I understand the 10 commitments could be considered categories, just looking more examples for reference. I'll think about that, and that'll be a great thing for me to talk about in a future webinar. Daniel says, improvise, modify their circumstance, alter the recipe, improvise the song. Right. When it comes to improvising, of course, however you're acting, you want to, if you're stuck at all, trying to get the result directly, then of course you want to look in the context, keeping in mind you want to modify the context, right? As long as that's what you mean by improvising. Perfectly fine to go straight for a result, but then if you don't get it, going the most direct route, then the answer is in context, and the answer is to realize that context will always feel less important than it is. Maybe there's an exception at some point of enlightenment, but at least follow that as a rule of thumb. And I'll continue to explain the gray area versus black and white process distinction. I'm really looking forward to explaining that more and more, but we make progress each time. But I have a lot more to say about the gray area process versus black and white. It's going to be very eye-opening. I think the whole model for reality and then how your mind works and how to achieve results and make progress, and therefore also help other people make progress and make sales, will build beautifully as we get more and more into the gray area process and the black and white process. Mike said, loved it. Great. Loved it. Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it. Julie loved it as well. Zach, thanks for another great webby. You're very welcome. You're very welcome. Susanna, you're very welcome. Yeah. Are we going to, you see how we're going to get you over whatever your next finish line is? You believe that? You believe in that progress? In that vision that I have for you with dimensionality? You're going to keep following dimensionality? Knocked it out of the park. Love it. Thank you. All I have to do is find someone else's book and read it. And you're very welcome, Megan. Yeah. I know you asked about closing and asking for the money at one point. And I always told you, as long as you stick with me, we'll get to it all. Might take a little time, but time is one of the dimensions that I operate in without being rushed. When you're not rushed, then you take advantage of the dimension of time in a different way. Cody says, wonderful. Thanks, David. Reading the book was a good idea. I liked it. Excellent. Better than cats. I'm going to read it again and again. You got to see that from Saturday Night Live. If not, you can look it up. Better than cats. SNL. It's pretty funny. It was people giving testimonials after a hypnotist performance. They were coming out and it was like interviewing, did you like the show? Yes, I loved it. It was better than cats. I'm going to see it again and again. And it was person after person saying the same thing after watching a hypnotist perform. Exceeded my expectations again. Great. It's hard to underestimate or overestimate me. It's hard, I think, to overestimate me. It's the natural thing for myself as well as to underestimate myself. Every time I esteem myself higher, I find that to be more accurate than the previous estimation. Think about that. But empirically, I find that to be true. In other words, I'm trying to work on increasing my own arrogance. I have an arrogance deficiency problem, and so does everyone else regarding me. I say that tongue-in-cheek, but actually I explained earlier with the contextual approach, you'll find the same thing, right, with people, and you probably already are, where you operate contextually, and people ask you, why are you doing that? It's not as important. And then you get the context all in your favor, and then you just reach out and grab, and say, oh, that was easy. Anyone can do that. You don't even chew it, and so forth. Always going to be underestimated. But then by some weird coincidence, you have everything you need in life. Constant success. Jennifer says, very insightful, David. Oh, let me read you this. Wayne Dyer quoted Lao Tzu in one of his books. Let me see this. Wayne Dyer, who I'm not saying I agree with everything or not with him, but he certainly has a lot of interesting thoughts. He wrote a book called Wisdom of the Ages where he's actually doing a survey and commentary on a bazillion people. Yeats, William Blake, Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Buddha, Lao Tzu. Anyway, so he quotes Lao Tzu on leadership in the Tao Te Ching, which I think is a cool book, by the way. And there's a subtitle, Acting Simply. The chapter is called Leadership. He has a different kind of keyword chapter for each of these different people throughout history that he's quoting something from. But so he calls it Leadership, and then Acting Simply might be a subtitle from the Tao Te Ching itself, which of course means like the way. Acting Simply, true leaders are hardly known to their followers. Next after them are the leaders that people know and admire. After them, those they fear. After them, those they despise. To give no trust is to get no trust. When the work's done with no fuss or boasting, ordinary people say, oh, we did it. In other words, a certain type of leadership, then you get other people involved in a certain way, and you just hit certain pressure points and contextual things, and then people do the rest. And legitimately, they can say, we did it, but you as the leader acted in certain contextual ways to help assure that thing. I've had to be a little bit more explicit. I think in today's day and age, there's with the internet and with gurus and with all the people out there clamoring for attention and putting themselves forward, I have to I think, be a little bit more forceful in terms of asserting that follow me kind of thing. But for years with OMG, for example, I hardly talked about myself at all, and there was plenty of success just for the contextual things that I do. There we go. Anyway, that's kind of interesting there too. Another awesome webinar. Thank you very much, Sajad. You're welcome, Evan. Jennifer, very insightful. Thanks, David. I find I've been focusing more on building context, and it has been reducing a lot of resistance. That is terrific, Jennifer. I love it. You're lucky you're not me. If I said that, people would say I want examples. And the problem is probably a lot of them are personal, or they involve business things that don't exactly apply, or that they would reveal personal things that I can't reveal. Joseph said, how awesome. Maria gave us some fist bumps. Bryce, value versus perceived value analogy. So rather than taking a client to the top of Mount Everest, bring them to what they perceive as valuable, in many cases a less prominent peak like Mount Marcy in the Adirondacks. That sounds great. That sounds exactly right. So good. It would be perhaps especially poignant if you, in my knowledge, I've never heard of Mount Marcy, but I've heard of Mount Everest. If Mount Marcy was much taller and better, of course I presume it's not, but if it was, then you would probably want to bring them to Mount Everest if that was the one they wanted to climb, as long as in either case it wasn't bad for them. Julie said, fine to be underestimated when you're constantly so successful. I agree. My only issue that my kind of quandary these days is that with the way I guess it's always been this way, but it used to be there's more like just gatekeepers, but which was impossible too. But now with the internet, it's like a balance. I don't know. I don't particularly want to be famous and so forth. After a year, I show people my car that I got, for example, just in case. I don't think it makes much difference, but although in terms of conversion and sales, it's exactly right for in-person stuff. I don't think I could have gotten a better car in the world. Their misjudgment doesn't change my success. Yeah, the issue is just to get started with people, you have to get their attention, right? So in order to help people, I think they need to notice and trust me to a certain degree, and that's my quandary. I don't need other people to esteem me for myself or for my ego at this point. I think I can say that fairly. I don't need it for the money nor for my self-worth or happiness. But to help people, I think I need a certain level of esteem or trust to start with the people. That I think it can be on the ideas themselves. The stuff that I share doesn't depend on me as a personality, cult of personality, ultimately, right? Because the ideas work for themselves. And not just work, but the epistemology shows itself and then builds from there, way of knowing what's true. But at first, to stick with me. That makes sense? Cool. She said, I think Mandela was great at that, the shepherd leader leading from behind. Yeah, very possibly true. Greg said, first live webinar I could get to since joining Sunday. Now I understand the David Mills Yoda reference. Thank you. Excellent. Post that in the 2017 group. Make sure we're getting everyone to pay attention to these. And you know why. Right? On Fletch's last webinar, he mentioned the fact that he learned from your teachings that SEO is not like a black-white thing. It's a service, and how transforming your mindset into that mindset of service can open up a new way of thinking. Yeah, thinking in terms of service rather than a product, I think might have been what he's saying too. Not like a concrete, like you, instead of saying my product is SEO, you think of it as a service, which you can even do if you have physical products, because really the value that you're adding is generally going to be a service of whatever sort that might be. Delivering it to them, educating them about it, backing it up if there's a defect, supporting it in some way. Awesome, guys. Appreciate you so much. Wonderful discussion and appreciation. Thank you as well for your very nice comments, and I will see you all next week, and I'll probably almost certainly have a great guest next week. I will talk to you guys then.